This is a bizarre and terrifying experience I had a couple of years ago. During this particular time, I was looking for a new apartment. I'd been living with a roommate in this really run-down, beat-up old place. I had recently gotten a new job and finally had a little money to get a place all to myself, and a place that would be nicer as well. The kind of apartment I wanted did not have to be perfect, but I certainly wanted something better than I currently had. This would only be my second apartment that I ever got, and the first by myself. I was excited about it and looked online for the new place. I was still pretty new to living in this general area and had moved there from another state when I got my apartment with the roommate. One night, as I was browsing online listings, I stumbled upon a peculiar ad. It wasn't on any of the regular sites, but rather on an obscure forum. The post described an old apartment building, claiming it had a unique charm and unbeatable price. The pictures showed an eerie, old Victorian building, but something about it intrigued me. I contacted the number listed and an odd-sounding man answered. He introduced himself as Mr. Jenkins and eagerly arranged for a viewing the next evening. When I arrived at the address, the building stood in a dilapidated part of town. Its Gothic architecture loomed over me, casting long shadows in the dim streetlight. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but convinced myself it was just nerves. Mr. Jenkins greeted me at the door, his pale face almost ghostly in the flickering light. He ushered me inside with an unnervingly wide smile. The interior was dark, with the air thick with dust and the scent of mildew. The walls were lined with faded, torn wallpaper, and the wooden floors creaked ominously with every step. As we walked through the apartment, I noticed odd things. Old, rusted chains in the basement, deep scratches on the bedroom door, and what appeared to be old bloodstains on the kitchen floor. Mr. Jenkins dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand, saying the building had character. Despite my growing unease, I was desperate to move out of my current place. The rent was incredibly low, and Mr. Jenkins promised to fix everything up before I moved in. I reluctantly agreed, signed the lease, and planned to move in the following week. The first few nights in the new apartment were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and I heard faint whispers in the dead of night. One evening, as I was unpacking, I found an old, dusty journal hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. It belonged to the previous tenant and detailed their descent into madness. They wrote about strange occurrences, mysterious figures appearing in the night, and an overwhelming sense of dread that consumed them. I tried to brush it off as the ramblings of a paranoid person, but the incidents escalated. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing in my room. My heart pounded as I slowly turned on the bedside lamp. The room was empty, but the breathing continued, coming from the closet. Gathering all my courage, I flung the door open, but nothing was there. The final straw came a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night to find Mr. Jenkins standing at the foot of my bed, his eyes glowing with a sinister light. He was mumbling incoherently, holding a rusty knife in his hand. I screamed and lunged for my phone, but it was gone. In a blind panic, I ran out of the apartment, not stopping until I reached a nearby police station. The police investigated but found no evidence of Mr. Jenkins or his sinister activities. The building was condemned and eventually torn down. I moved far away and never looked back, but I still have nightmares about that place. The memory of Mr. Jenkins' glowing eyes haunts me to this day. I used to live in an old, creaky apartment when I was younger. It was actually a decrepit house converted into a duplex. My side had a kitchen, living room, bedroom, and bathroom. There was a narrow staircase leading down to a tiny entryway and the door. The other side, I assumed, had a similar layout, but I never saw or knew who lived there. I lived in that apartment for several months. It was cheap and close to my work, but otherwise it was nothing special. For the first month, everything seemed normal. I worked a lot, and when I was home, I had no issues. But then things started to change. I began waking up in the middle of the night. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was just stress from work. But it kept happening. I'd wake up, feel uneasy, and then drift back to sleep. One night, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. I sat up and listened, but there was nothing. I wondered if I was dreaming. The third time it happened, I was sure I heard something. It was a faint, almost inaudible sound, like someone whispering. I sat up, heart pounding, but the noise stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Then one night, I woke up feeling an intense sense of dread. I rolled over and stared into the darkness of my room. That's when I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak, like someone was opening my bedroom door. My blood ran cold as I watched the door slowly swing open. A dark figure stepped into the room. It was a man, but I couldn't see his face. He stood there, motionless, as if he was studying me. I was paralyzed with fear. The man then raised something to his face, and I realized it was a camera. A flash of light blinded me as he took a picture. Then he backed out of the room and disappeared into the hallway. I lay there, heart racing, unable to move. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to get up and check the apartment. I turned on all the lights and searched every corner, but there was no sign of the intruder. I then noticed something strange at the end of the hallway. There was a door, hidden behind a table and a lamp. It was painted the same color as the wall, making it almost invisible. I had been told this door was permanently locked, but it was slightly ajar. It led to the other side of the duplex. I realized the man must have been entering my apartment through this door. I moved the table and closed the door, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I stayed up the rest of the night, terrified. As soon as morning came, I contacted the building manager. I told them everything and immediately started looking for a new place to live. I stayed with a friend for the next few nights, unable to return to that apartment. Eventually, the police caught the man. He was my neighbor and had been sneaking into my apartment for weeks, watching me while I slept. The times I woke up in the middle of the night must have been when he was leaving. I shudder to think what could have happened if I hadn't woken up that night. To this day, I can't forget the terror of seeing that dark figure in my room. It's the most horrifying experience I've ever had, and it haunts me every time I close my eyes. I live in a relatively ordinary apartment, but the one I lived in 2 years ago was quite different. The building had long, dimly lit hallways and numerous units. I had a parking spot in the underground garage, and there were several apartment buildings in the complex. It was right in the middle of my lease, around 6 months in, when some genuinely disturbing things started to happen. My apartment was on the second floor, towards the end of a gloomy hallway. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of furious banging on my door. It was a Friday night around 3 a.m. Someone was hammering on my door with such force that it felt like it would break. I lay frozen in bed, paralyzed by fear. After about 10 seconds of relentless pounding, I decided to get up. As soon as I stepped out of my bedroom, the knocking abruptly stopped. I could hear footsteps echoing down the hallway. I cautiously peered through the peephole, but no one was there. I didn't dare open the door. I went back to bed, my heart still racing, and somehow managed to fall asleep. The next day, I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling. Being woken up at 3 a.m., I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone drunk coming home from the bars. It was Friday night, after all. But the intensity of the knocking made me uneasy. A week later, it happened again. This time, the pounding on my door was even louder. Fear gripped me. I didn't get up, just lay there, praying for it to stop. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking ceased. I stayed awake for hours, terrified of what might happen next. Several nights passed uneventfully. Then, one night, I was sitting in my living room late at night when the knocking started again. It was more aggressive this time, like someone was trying to break down the door. I stayed on the couch, paralyzed with fear. The pounding lasted longer, maybe around 30 seconds, then stopped. I heard footsteps retreating. I couldn't bring myself to look through the peephole. Weeks went by and I began to relax, thinking it was over. But one night, past midnight, I was in my living room when the knocking started again. This time it was accompanied by a sinister whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling. The knocking and whispering continued for almost a minute. I mustered the courage to get up and walk to the door. As I approached, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. I looked through the peephole and saw no one. Gathering all my courage, I opened the door slightly and peered into the hallway. At the far end, I saw a shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. The figure turned its head, and even from that distance, I felt its gaze piercing through me. My blood ran cold. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring. Then it slowly backed away into the darkness. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. For the rest of my time in that apartment, I never heard the knocking again, but I always felt like I was being watched. The building's eerie atmosphere seemed to intensify, and I could never shake off the feeling of dread. I have no idea who that figure was or why they targeted my door. But the memory of those nights still haunts me, and I shudder to think what might have happened if I had opened the door sooner.